we first need to acknowledge that it is an absolutely incredible molecule. There's nothing quite like it. This is no longer a science experiment or a model or an engineering idea.
I mean, this is a really radical concept. It's something that people have been talking about for some time.
How are we going to take these cheap, available geothermal resources and then move them to demand centers?
Cracking that particular nut is a really big one.
From the time that we received our permits to the first production of hydrogen was 69 days. I think it might be among the most energy-dense compounds that we're aware of, maybe short of uranium and plutonium.
People have been looking at things like synthetic fuels for trucks.
I mean, my biggest problem is people are skeptical of this. They hear synthetic fuels on a pathway to cheaper than fossil fuels, like sounds too good to be true. I say, look, I felt the same way when I first discovered this company. I want my great-grandchildren consuming clean hydrocarbon fuels in their day-to-day life, and this is the only show in town to be able to deliver that future.
So what happens next with Syntholene? Welcome back to the Investing Markets and Money podcast. And this week we're talking about jet fuel, which is a topic close to many people's minds, as we've seen the price of jet fuel going up in many parts of Europe. Obviously, some people are worried about going on their summer holidays, how much that's going to cost them. So it's something both holiday makers and indeed investors are very focused on. And on the podcast today, we have Dan Sutton, CEO of Syntholene, who is going to be telling us a little bit more about their revolutionary approach to an alternative to jet fuel. Welcome to the podcast, Dan.
Thanks so much, Stuart. Great to be here and excited to share the good news with your audience that we are no longer in a place where synthetic hydrocarbon fuels are an expensive science experiment, and we've got our first bit of evidence that we can see them approaching a more economically rational transition opportunity away from fuels that are conjoined and somewhat hamstrung to the volatility and costs of fossil crude.
I mean, this is a really radical concept. It's something that people have been talking about for some time, but actually achieving that is been a little bit more of a challenge. I was wondering if you could give us an overview of Syntholene itself, the company, and also what inspired its creation in the first place.
Absolutely. And first and foremost, the radical premise of being able to synthesize hydrocarbon fuels more cost efficiently with higher performance and by using captured carbon to enable a minimization of that particular externality, as well as decoupling them from fossil feedstocks, it does sound pretty extreme. Although that really is a function of the abundance of fossil-based petroleum products that we've enjoyed for so long. And we do actually synthesize most natural products that we discover and then convert into mass market products. One of my chief engineer's favorite examples is aspirin. Aspirin was initially discovered in small quantities in a particular bark of a tree, and that was seen to have these analgesic properties and good for your heart and things like this. And so the next logical step was to mass produce the trees. This is what we've been doing in the oil and gas world with the enhanced abilities to efficiently extract different grades of crude, horizontal drilling techniques and fracking. That's the equivalent of saying, okay, let's give this some economies of scale. But it wasn't until after they synthesized the aspirin molecule, let's say that the mass manufacturing or the planting of large volumes of trees offered a 10 or 15x price efficiency because of its concentrated production, while the synthesis of that molecule then increased that efficiency about 1,000x. And this is why aspirin is not a luxury good. It's not, crazy expensive. You can buy it in the corner store for a few bucks, no matter where you are in the world. And that really is a function of chemical synthesis. And so this is true for a lot of different products, motor oil, a diversity of other petroleum products that we are actually actively synthesizing today. But the idea of getting cheap synthetic fuel has just been a revelation reasonably of the last sort of 5 to 10 years. Now, synthetic fuel's actually been around a long time in the contexts of coal to liquids and gas to liquids. These are technologies that we've been operating effectively for about 100 years. But with the advent of cheaper extraction costs and better extraction technology for crude oil, they became economically uncompetitive. Then we move to this new paradigm of being able to use electrolysis to produce hydrogen, capture carbon, and then fuel synthesis reactors, such as the Fischer Tropsch reactor, which once again was discovered in the 1920s and sort of commercialized substantially through the 40s and 50s. We've been attaching this to renewable energy sources. Now all of a sudden we have this new opportunity for cleaner, greener, carbon neutral abilities to use low emissions or no emissions electricity sources to produce synthetic fuel. But the problem has been its expense. When you couple the industrial process demands of electrolysis and fuel synthesis to intermittent and expensive electricity sources such as wind and solar, those are really great energy sources in a bunch of applications. But as soon as you need to apply those intermittent sources to pretty consistent industrial production, especially if that production is heat intensive, but we can come back to that, you get this tough thermodynamic compromise and just not a very pragmatic use of intermittent sources that might be better suited to other applications. And so now we've taken it a step further. This is work that's been substantially accomplished by Syntholene, but also by our co-founders, our peers, our colleagues. Some instrumental work went on at the National Renewable Energy Lab and the Idaho National Lab that looked at conjoining more baseload firm power sources that also come with a bonus of waste heat. These were sort of originally viewed in the context of being able to utilize nuclear reactors to power synthetic fuel production, which I think is an amazing opportunity. And hopefully, as we see a new nuclear renaissance taking shape over the course of the next decade, we should look at the use of the industrial process heat that inherently is produced by high temperature fission reactors and small modular reactors as an excellent energy source to various industrial processes, but chemical synthesis is there. But more closer to home, we can also utilize geothermal power. Geothermal power has sort of been the unsung hero of the energy transition, and it does represent a low emissions, base load, consistently available power source with this bonus of having a waste heat profile that isn't effectively captured by the electricity generation infrastructure and the spinning of a turbine. So, all this is to say, in the algebra of wanting to get synthetic fuel that's high quality and low cost, we must use our energy very efficiently, and we must also choose the energy sources which are the lowest cost and the most industrially suitable, hence that base load. And that's the thread that Syntholene's been pulling now. Our engineering team's been working on this for well over a decade. The company itself existed to commercialize some of their engineering breakthroughs that we saw in the early 2010s. And we've been operating now, moving from the lab to our first operating demonstration facility. We turned that on in June 22nd of this year, and it has been producing hydrogen since that time at exceptionally high purities and exceptionally high efficiencies, showing that this is no longer a science experiment or a model or an engineering idea, but that this work that has underpinned this pathway to low cost and high efficiency fuel synthesis using baseload power and the integration of waste heat is actually working practically. And we think it is a pretty massive inflection point, not just for Syntholene, but for the entire renewable hydrogen industry and for all of the derivative products that come from being able to produce low cost green or renewable hydrogen.
And so, if we think about the sort of context of this, obviously here in the UK, we've had a number of listed green hydrogen companies, ventures that they've done well, but they've also, I'm not going to name names, but some of them have just not really delivered on the promise. And I'm guessing that's because of the fact that they're relying on less consistent sources of clean energy for the delivery of that hydrogen. And what you're talking about here is something that's using geothermal energy, which is much more consistent. It's going to be there all the time. It's not like the wind stops blowing or the sun goes behind the clouds.
I think it speaks to the unfortunate reality that the production of low cost renewable energy, low cost renewable hydrogen, and low cost renewable hydrogen derivatives such as synthetic fuel are not going to be decentralized. It's a bit of a double negative. They must be centralized, much the same way that you can't produce cheap crude oil from a region where the oil is heavy or entrained with bitumen or entrained with sand and salt and mud, or has sulfur in it. You have to go where the sweet light crude is shallow, accessible, where it pumps effectively. And I think that analogy is really strong for how we envision the future of synthetic fuel production infrastructure. If you go to places with expensive electricity constrained grids and not a huge abundance of low cost renewable electricity access or energy access generally, it's going to be very difficult for you to produce a low cost synthetic fuel or a low cost hydrogen as a precursor to those synthetic fuels. So in the UK, I think there's a ton of innovation and a bunch of insight. There's also a huge amount of financial capital, but perhaps applying that capital and insight to regions with a more viable access to industrially available low cost electricity and heat. That's the thesis that we're pulling on for sure. And so geothermal is interesting because most massive geothermal resources in the world are inherently stranded. God did not ordain to put shallow, hot geothermal resources right next to metropolitan centers in most cases. There are some cases of it, but it's pretty rare. And even in the largest geothermal power plants in the world, places like Helshedi, right outside of Reykjavik, or the Cape Station in Utah, the known resources are substantially larger than the demand. And so then all of a sudden we have this transmission problem. How are we going to take these cheap available geothermal resources, which are cheap if you use them where they are, and then move them to demand centers? Well, moving electricity through power lines is very, very expensive. So you get this inherent stranding effect with a lot of large geothermal resources. And the Syntholene thesis is essentially to arbitrage that by co-locating fuel synthesis infrastructure, using the energy where the energy exists, and then transforming that energy or synthesizing that high electricity demand synthesis process into a shelf stable and easily transportable liquid fuel, such as Jet A1 kerosene. It's feasible we could also make e-diesel, e-gasoline, other types of hydrocarbon products, which are really easy to transport, in that we do a lot of it today. They're so easy to transport that in some nations in the world, they produce a huge amount of crude oil. They move them across oceans to get refined, and then they buy the refined fuel products back and ship them back. So we do benefit from about 150 years worth of deeply entrenched petroleum transmission infrastructure, which is orders of magnitude cheaper than trying to move electricity around.
So you chose Iceland as the location for your demonstration plant. Can you explain a little bit about the decision-making process there and the sort of level of cooperation you're getting from the local government as well?
Absolutely. And I mean, at a first glance, we didn't have to do too much research to appreciate that Iceland does have an abundance of geothermal availability, probably far more than their population could ever consume domestically in the form of electricity. I think right now their grid generates about 2.6 gigawatts, which is pretty exceptional for a nation of 400,000. Much of that is used by industrial users that take advantage of the low cost geothermal and hydroelectric electricity, which is why you see activities like aluminum smelting and data centers taking root in Iceland, despite its relatively small nature. And the geothermal is also characteristically quite shallow and quite hot, which makes it more economic than deeper and cooler resources to be able to extract and utilize. So Iceland also has a lot of ambition around expanding its geothermal power plant potential. They have grid expansion initiatives that span the whole country, looking at special zones where they can have industrial users that are either adjacent to or co-located to their existing power plant infrastructure. And so this is a nation that has demonstrated its ambition and execution capability in delivering clean energy independence. Their grid is entirely renewable, largely based on hydroelectric and geothermal. They still, however, import a lot of fossil fuels, and I think that that's something that Syntholene can address, both in a commercial but social context. But as we started to do more and more business in Iceland, create relationships in Iceland, recruit project developers, EPCs, and work with our particular municipality as well as the federal government, what we noticed is this incredible industriousness that is unencumbered by the same bureaucratic constraints that we see permeate the rest of the European Union, the UK, even in the United States. You're not exempt from needing to get a whole bunch of different regulatory incentives aligned before you can proceed with a project. And so in Iceland, we found that we needed to make a really strong case, not just to the effectiveness of our own team, our capability to bring foreign investment, but also our ability to mitigate community concerns, mitigate environmental risks. And as we did that consistently, then once that decision was made, essentially, we found a huge amount of advocacy and a huge amount of thinning out bureaucracy where it would otherwise be superfluous. Iceland has been exceptionally functional through our permitting process. They've been very quick to address concerns and answer questions. And this is typical of a nation who wants to see industrial diversification and is ready to stand behind that desire. So I see this kind of conflict often enough in the Western world where even when you have a political body or a leader that is aligned to seeing more industry, more growth, it isn't just one person's decision, then oftentimes behind their back, the bureaucracy can undermine those efforts. And we're just so used to having these massive leviathans of overcoming bureaucratic constraints to build anything, even things that are, uncontroversially socially positive, light speed rail, new renewable energy resources, all these kinds of things. And so hopefully our investment in Iceland is a signal to others to say, cheap power, great, co-located heat, amazing, industrial workforce, also valuable. But these kinds of investments in this kind of infrastructure are going to concentrate in places where bureaucracy is at least manageable. Give us a set of hoops to jump through. We will jump through those hoops. But if the goalposts keep moving, that's a problem that I think has become rampant and prolific across the Western world. And it is slowing down the progress of society towards socially beneficial outcomes. So let's all take that seriously, take it on board, and think about how we can create a manageable situation that I believe can really effectively mitigate externalities and risks at about 10% of the complexity that currently exists.
Would you say that's been a big factor with the speed at which you've managed to get the demonstration plant up and running? Because it sounds to me like you were actually got that functioning ahead of your original timetable.
That is absolutely true, and we are exceptionally proud of our deployment of that infrastructure. From the time that we received our permits to the first production of hydrogen was 69 days. Now, I've got to tip my hat to our engineers, our project management team, our local contractors. The construction was an absolute tactical strike, and we were able to accomplish that because of the exceptionally thorough planning process that we put in for the year before we received those permits. So, plan very thoroughly and then deploy very quickly is an excellent model for complex construction projects that we will be emulating as we envision our first stages of commercial scale up and on into industrial scale over the next decade. But I will say too that that wouldn't have been feasible without the alignment of that permit issuance, which we did a really good job, I think, internally at Syntholene of laying the groundwork for making their life easy, giving them a very simple understanding, an elegant understanding of how we're mitigating risks, where the core risk drivers are. We were also co-located to an existing power plant, the Husavik Power Station. So this is a site that has already had a degree of permitting and risk mitigation associated with its operations. And so that's another pretty good lesson. Wherever there are industrial parks or co-location opportunities, that's a great way to refine your permit process and simplify, saying we're not doing anything too much more dangerous or impactful or with negative externalities outside of this power plant's operation. So this is a good place for us to go. So I would say that we did about 3 to 4 months worth of groundwork before we even applied for the permits. And those permits were in fact issued in 2 weeks. I have never heard of permit issuance, even for a demonstration scale facility with relatively modular infrastructure, being deployed so quickly. And that sent a really strong message to us. This country, this municipality, these are places where it's going to be great for Syntholene to invest and do business. And they're going to be hyper effective for us to move through the complexities, inevitable complexities that are going to come with commercial scale up. At least we know this isn't going to compound the complexities. This is going to allow us an efficient ability to demonstrate our compliance, to demonstrate that we can adhere to regulations and code standards without needing to get too into the weeds on disturbing native bat populations or something like this.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And I guess one of the things that really interested me about Syntholene when I first looked at it was, again, going back to some of the examples here in the UK, people have been looking at things like synthetic fuels for trucks. But the idea that, here comes a company that we're looking at potentially producing synthetic fuels, jet fuels. I mean, jet fuel has always been one of those that's like the big bear out there that no one's really got a proper solution to yet. There are thousands of planes flying around the world every day. They consume a lot of fossil fuels. Cracking that particular nut is a really big one. I mean, that's quite a big challenge. And for a company like yours, that must be really exciting to be looking at a solution for that.
It's so exciting. And kerosene, jet A1, jet fuel is a molecule like no other. Like, I think it might be among the most energy dense compounds that we're aware of, maybe short of uranium and plutonium. I don't think we're going to be powering planes on those anytime soon. But if we are going to try to improve on this petroleum based hydrocarbon molecule, we first need to acknowledge that it is an absolutely incredible molecule. There's nothing quite like it, to the effect that I've seen an image of a refueling hose going into a jet's wing. And that refueling hose, for the time that the fuel is running through the hose, whatever 25 or 35 minutes to refuel the plane, it is moving more energy than the world's largest nuclear power plant is producing. So crazy to think just how much energy density is actually going into those planes. And that also speaks to how much the demand for aviation currently is, like how much currently exists and how much it's rising. So you said there's a few thousand planes in the air at any given time, right now, midnight, 3 a.m., all over the world. There are approximately 1.5 million people in the sky. That's like the size of the population of Barcelona in the air all the time. And this demand, the amount of people in the sky, is moving up and to the right so aggressively over the course of the next 30 years. There are billions and billions of people, the majority of the world, probably 60, 70% of the world, have never flown on a plane. And they want to fly on a plane. And the projected demand increase for consumer aviation is set to triple between now and 2050. So if we acknowledge, wow, kerosene, amazing molecule, super high energy dense, serving a massive and growing market, well, unfortunately, it does have negative externalities. It has the externalities that it is very difficult to filter its exhaust. You mentioned road trucking. Well, road trucks at least can have a catalytic converter. I think those catalytic converters remove 98% of the deleterious emissions that come out of the back end of that truck. And the emissions from aviation flight are not just carbon. Carbon is where we all kind of center around, and minimizing CO2 and all of that is kind of where most policy measures angle towards. But the deleterious adulterants that come off the back of a jet turbine also include copper and cadmium and lead and sulfur oxides and nitrogen oxides and all of these greenhouse gases and other adulterants that have a compounding effect on changing the chemical composition of the atmosphere And even the most rabid climate change deniers still say like the gradual chemical change of the atmosphere is probably ill-advised. So we want to mitigate those externalities as effectively as we can. We also sort of touched on earlier on this call that there are other externalities associated with deep dependence on fossil fuel supply chains. We've got extreme price volatility that happens even with the most minimal supply chain interruptions. We consume about 105 million barrels a day of crude oil. And if you turn that off for one day, it would be panic in the streets. Like we cannot overstate how reliant we are on fossil fuels to power our society and bring us all of our goods and food and services, and everything we touch is brought to us by fossil fuels or made of fossil fuels or both. And so getting a substitute product that without fossil fuel supply chains or without fossil fuel crude inputs can effectively substitute for the energy densities, for the demand acceleration, and mitigate some of the externalities, this really is a holy grail if we're able to deliver it. And the great news is that the technology exists. The engineering is quite mature. We understand how to produce synthetic kerosene and have done so for many decades. It's just been a problem of unit economics. When synthetic kerosene is today 5 to 7 to 10 times the price of fossil based kerosene, it's really difficult to imagine a set of incentives that would compel people to self interestedly consume that product. However, with the advent of this thermally integrated hydrogen production that Syntholene is actively demonstrating right now, even at a small scale, we might be able to bring that premium to like 1.5x or 2x. And now all of a sudden people can say, okay, well, I got to make a bit of a compromise. I got to add a little bit of the cost. But I also know that the costs of synthetic fuels are going to come down with economies of scale. So maybe we entertain those cost premiums for a time, and instead of having to envision a world with perpetual subsidy and perpetual market mandates to obligate people to consume the fuel, we can actually see a pathway to self-interested consumption of these synthetic fuels, which, notwithstanding subsidies, mandates, Syntholene's technology, these synthetic fuels will be cost competitive with fossil fuels reasonably within our lifetimes, feasibly within the next decade. So this is all happening, and any, excuse my horrible pun, fuel we can throw on the fire to accelerate the industrial production and accelerate the economies of scale associated with these synthetic fuels. We now live in the world where we can imagine them being cleaner, being higher quality, and being cheaper. And I think that this is a civilizational level unlock. We absolutely must lean into it. And it probably justifies trillions and trillions of dollars worth of accelerated investment. But maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself. And fairly enough, I'm the CEO of a synthetic fuel company, so I might be perhaps a little bit biased.
And do you envisage the output from Syntholene being not just jet fuel, though? I presume there's other potential use cases there as well.
Absolutely. And synthetic hydrocarbons can produce any hydrocarbon chain feasibly, with blending and fuel additives alongside a sort of secondary refinement process. It's feasible for us to be able to make e-diesel even as a co-product of an e-SAF production system. E-gasoline, I think, is a really exciting prospect and can be seen as kind of a parallel path to electrification of a lot of road transport, which is also amazing and like a really great thing to be leaning into. And then other petroleum products, ethylenes, naphtha and gases, all the way down to lubricants and heavy waxes and greases that have these specialty applications. But because the synthetic pathway does not leave the end product entrained with some of the inherent adulterants that come from the fossil fuel refinement process, we actually get better quality products at every one of those fractions. So if you're in the market for some hyper specialized, molecularly pure lubricant, like high viscosity hydrocarbon lubricant, synthetic should be the choice that you make. And people make this choice every day when they buy synthetic motor oil when they get their oil changed. If you've got basically any car, but especially a bit of a nicer car, when you go to get your oil change, they say, do you want synthetic or do you want normal oil? And you say, well, what's the difference? And they say, well, synthetic's a little bit more expensive, but it's pure. It's going to extend the time between the time you need to make an oil change. It's going to extend the operational life of your motor. It's going to lead to less gunk and adulterants getting clogged up in the engine. And so, like, all of these things make a pretty easy choice. Okay, maybe I'll pay 30% more, but I'll go less often. I pay the premium for synthetic oil just so I don't have to go as much. But that's a product and a consumption choice that people are making self-interestedly every day already. So that's probably a pretty strong analog, is given the chance to pay a little bit more, at least at the outset, and get a higher purity product. That's something that I think most people can wrap their head around.
And you've got the demonstration plant up and running in Iceland. So what happens next with Syntholene?
I mean, I don't want to skip over the fact that we have the demonstration
Yeah.
plant up and running. This is absolutely incredible. It took a huge amount of effort and is the first time in the field that we are actively demonstrating the efficiencies in terms of electricity in combined heat, reducing the kilowatt hours per kilogram necessary to crack hydrogen into a place where it's now substantially cost competitive with fossil fired hydrogen, substantially cost competitive as a feedstock into synthetic fuels. This is a massive unlock that I think the entire hydrogen sector has been looking forward to for perhaps the last decade and a half. And it's only a few weeks old, the news. We haven't exactly seen people like falling over themselves to come get looks at the facility, although we have had some pretty cool tours with large energy companies and oil and gas companies that have taken a pretty quick amount of notice. And so this is the smallest minimum viable increment that we could build to show outside of a lab environment, outside of a PowerPoint presentation, outside of a engineering model, that this does in fact work. The co-location and integration of baseload firm geothermal electricity at the right price with co-located heat results in this massive unlock, or long anticipated unlock, of hydrogen that can be produced at an efficiency which makes it a viable input for lower cost derivative products. And so now we are running that machine. We're running it hard. We're running it aggressively and spooling it up and spooling it down and changing parameters over our first sort of 1,000-hour effects test, which we think is the duration that's going to give us the longitudinal data to be able to validate, okay, this is not just working well in its preliminary results, but it actually has consistency and viability as an industrial supply chain component. And from there, we'll third party validate those results. We'll share those results with some of our prospective strategic partners. There's quite a few now that are interested in, okay, we've got this demo facility. How do we put the components together to turn it into a larger first commercial instance, which will still be relatively small, but it will produce an economic output and have a viable economic model. And so the third party validation of those results by people who aren't Syntholene and people who have a history in validating these new and somewhat exotic types of technology, I think that would be a really interesting proof point to be able to say, hey, with a separate engineering stamp on it, this shows that the system is working the way that it is intended and it's delivering unprecedented efficiencies. And so I think we can look forward to the results of that test a bit later on this year. And that'll be one of the key components in our larger sort of project data room that we'll be hopefully using to attract strategic capital, strategic engineering and industrial expertise, and get ourselves the right people around the table to go and attack this first smaller commercial instance, which is absolutely the next thing that Syntholene wants to do. And we want to do it as fast as we possibly can.
And so basically, if someone's, people in the energy space listening to this podcast, and there will be some out there, if they're interested in the technology and the plant, they can go out and see you guys in Iceland and have a look at it.
They absolutely can. They absolutely should. After we see the plant, we'll go to the Ocean Geo Spa, which is an absolutely gorgeous hot pool at the 66th parallel in Husavik. We were there right after the summer solstice, just as we opened the plant. And we went and celebrated with the team and fed them well and got the guys a few beers for those that partake. And we were sitting out there. It feels like a Sunday afternoon, and it's 11:30 at night, and the sun never quite set. So as we get into winter, we get the opposite size of that. But for those people who have stakes and interest in the future of the energy transition, and not just an energy transition based on paying a green premium out of a moral obligation, but an energy transition that's market driven and economically self interested. I would really encourage people to dive deep on what this demonstration facility means. We've actually published a third party techno-economic report by KBR, Kellogg Brown and Root, which are one of the most celebrated petroleum and energy transition EPCs in the world. And they've identified our ability, albeit in idealized conditions in Iceland with the right price on the geothermal, to be able to produce our hydrogen as a feedstock below $2 per kilogram. Their price target is $1.75. It may be that we can improve on that with economies of scale and other efficiencies as we go. But that breaches this $2 per kilogram hydrogen production barrier that many of your audience will be aware of. This has been targeted for over 10 years. If we can get green hydrogen below $2 a kilo, then all of a sudden, all of its derivative products and applications can be utilized self interestedly without this insane green premium. For context, the average green hydrogen price in Europe today is about $7 and 50 cents, maybe 6.75 euros or €7. So it is a pretty meaningful change. And this is a big deal for the entire hydrogen sector and anybody that's interested in hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives. But reach out to us, reach out to Syntholene. We're happy to furnish people with copies of the report. It's not just us saying it, it's actually the second validation report that we've published amid a bunch of red teaming. I mean, my biggest problem is people are skeptical of this. They hear synthetic fuels on a pathway to cheaper than fossil fuels, like sounds too good to be true. I say, look, I felt the same way when I first discovered this company and this opportunity and was lucky to join the team. But we have enough validation from enough credible people that this is really worthy of scrutiny. Come in and tear our assumptions down and tell us where we've gotten it wrong. We appreciate it's a small scale operation now, and commercial scale up has its own basket of risks, but these are tractable risks. They're engineering risks. They're risks that we overcome every day, every time we build a new offshore oil rig, for instance, which could be 100 times as complicated as what we're trying to envision. So the good news is that this time has really arrived, and we are seeing the evidence for it practically in the field today at this demo facility operation, which makes it a lot different than a model or a lab scale deployment.
I think it's really exciting. I really do. I mean, we look at a lot of different companies, in the course of a given month, and Syntholene certainly stands out as something that, the word game changing is used a lot in the stocks industry, but I think Syntholene definitely, for me, seems to have the potential to be a real game changer.
I agree. Of course, I agree. And it's also poorly understood and sort of in its own little category that doesn't have a lot of media headlines and doesn't have a lot of focus today, which in the business of the armchair traders audience trying to find asymmetric bets, a contrarian thesis that isn't widely understood. This is like right in the wheelhouse. Now, it isn't widely understood for now, but there will be incremental proof points and strategic partnerships and off takers and all kinds of other people coming to join our camp over the next years. And I think that will elevate this conversation to a place of higher visibility incrementally, slowly but steady over time. But I mean, to zoom out and to think that, okay, what are our headlines dominated by? The AI revolution, which we're huge beneficiaries of, and we use AI every day, and it's an incredible, it's a new world of research and automation. Space travel, amazing, so cool. We're going to have a crazy base on the moon in the next 20 years. Like all this stuff is amazing. But where does the ability to decouple from fossil fuels and envision a new pathway to hydrocarbon fuels that are clean, that are high performance, and whose inputs are substantially abundant? Like hydrogen is the most available atom and molecule in the universe, probably. Carbon also very, very prolific on Earth. We can find a lot of it. Now, extracting those things and combining them cost efficiently, that's a bit of a different paradigm. And here we are demonstrating our capabilities. But I'm reticent to use the word unlimited. I don't think regulators and lawyers would like the word unlimited, but it is close to unlimited the scalability that we can imagine far beyond fossil fuel reserves, like far beyond the next 50 to 100 years of cheap fossil fuel availability that we might have. I want my great grandchildren consuming clean hydrocarbon fuels in their day to day life. And this is the only show in town to be able to deliver that future. And that future, the technologies exist, the engineering has been done. This isn't something where we need to bend the laws of physics or have some other, great scientific paradigm shift in order to be able to imagine it. So I think the future of cheap synthetic fuels is poorly understood and underreported. And maybe that's like jobs for guys like you and me, Stuart, is to get this visibly into the world. And I'm making it my life's mission. If I get to do this for the next 50 years, I'd be so privileged.
No, I think you're absolutely right there. I think this is a very, very exciting project for people to be working on right now. I appreciate you're really busy as well, and you've got to go. But very quickly before we finish, I just wanted to ask you if you had one piece of advice for someone who is passionate about this kind of clean tech venture, is thinking of launching their own, what would that be?
First things first, you got to get the right people on the bus. The only way Syntholene exists today in its current iteration and how it will be in 10 years from now if we're successful in executing our goals is that our early founding team is exceptionally talented and exceptionally passionate. They really, really care about this. I think the people on my team would die for this mission. And so if you find yourself looking for co-founders, looking for your early team, your engineering, your technical talent, finance talent, whatever, if you start to smell that, like, okay, this could be a bit of a flash in the pan and we can make some money and we'll go on to the next thing, you young founders, entrepreneurs, in my experience, should be allergic to those kind of personalities. Get the business right and build in the right arena, and all of that financial, windfall will happen for you. But if it's something you're constantly thinking about and your co-founders are constantly thinking about, that should be a massive red flag. And so I would say I have talents on my team that no one else has, and the rest of my team have talents that I definitely do not have. And finding that product that's greater than the sum of its parts in the human element of how you bring teams together, if you get that core nucleus right, the first 3, 4, or 5 people, then that enables you to bring the next 20 on and keep that DNA and keep that cultural tenet of a mission worth dying for, and a team that you can rely on to pick up the slack where you lack skills. So that's been typical of my experience with Syntholene and other companies that I've built, and it never goes out of style. Quality is not a fad, commitment, the right kinds of technical talent. There's abundant smart people. We're all smarter than we used to be. We've got information age access. Find a thing you can get committed to, and then be ready to suffer for glory.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, for coming on the show this afternoon. Really appreciate it. I think, as I said already, I think it's a very exciting stock, very exciting prospect for the energy sector as well, and wish you all the best with it.
Really, really appreciate it, and so lucky that I get to bring this message that within our lifetimes, we're going to see cheap synthetic fuel flowing through our pumps and engines and motors and turbines. And if Syntholene has anything to do with it, we'll be doing it in the next 10 years.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan.
The content of this podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. The views and opinions expressed by guests or hosts are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Armchair Trader. Investments can go up and down in value, and you may not get back the amount you originally invested. Past performance is not a reliable indicator of future results. We do not provide any personal investment, tax, or legal advice. Always do your own research or seek independent professional advice before making any financial decisions. The Armchair Trader is a media company and is not authorized or regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority.